I'm very happy to welcome our viewers in Germany and in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're more than 3 weeks into violent conflict in the Middle East, which was sparked by a series of coordinated attacks on October 7th by the terrorist group Hamas. To try to unpack the situation and the broader implications in the region, I'm pleased to welcome Middle East expert Professor Dr. Eckart Woertz. He is the director of the GIGA Institute for Middle East Studies and professor for contemporary history and politics of the Middle East at the University of Hamburg. Eckart, herzlich willkommen. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
Well, while I'm happy to see you, I'm sorry that the circumstances are as dire as they are, which have brought us together again. But as I was thinking about interesting people who could help us understand what's going on and what might come next, I could hardly think of a better observer of the Middle East than you. So thank you again. As we've all been reading, as we've all been seeing, Israel has said that the next stage of the war has begun after expanding its ground operations and continuing air and missile strikes. Israel has also warned that this will be a, quote, long war. And so I thought we could maybe start by getting your assessment of how things might unfold in the days and weeks ahead.
Well, first of all, managing expectations, I do not have a crystal ball like anybody else. I think the big question is, will there be a more regional escalation? And even if there's a regional escalation with Hezbollah in Lebanon, for example, will it be contained? Yeah? That part I'm rather optimistic about. Yeah? Typically in the MENA region, often you have a lot of 5 minutes to midnight rhetoric, yeah, very alarmist, various groups that are struggling not only with each other, but also try to mobilize support, also in terms of financial support, have an incentive to rather be a bit on the dramatic side, if I may say so. So you have a history, let's say, of very colorful rhetoric and of painting the situation more dire than it is already. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we do not have an escalation like regional wide war, because simply the interests are not lined up for that. Also, you have to see, for Hezbollah, for Iran, is essentially a tool of deterrence against Israel, where we have a kind of shadow war going on, regular assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists, for example, by Israeli intelligence services. So why should they risk this deterrence, right? Because should there be really a major escalation with Hezbollah, that would really mean such massive retaliation of Israel that this deterrent might be gone for a considerable amount of time. So I rather tend to see that it might be that the major theater of conflict will remain in and around Gaza. But here, of course, we could see a major escalation in terms of humanitarian crises. We see that already happening. We see very worrying reports about possible Israeli plans of expulsion of Israeli population. A second Nakba, a catastrophe like in 1948 that Palestinians are fearing. When the Israeli army tells people in the Gaza to move to the south, they can return afterwards. Nobody believes them. Let's face it. So I see the escalation potential here rather on the humanitarian side than on this kind of regional security arena. Also because, yes, there's no lack of addresses of solidarity right now regarding the Palestinians, but Egypt, Saudi Arabia, even Turkey do not have really an incentive to step into this conflict. And Iran would be the most likely candidate, but as I've said, even Iran, this escalation now was a major win for it. Why should it risk that? And it would risk its deterrence in the form of Hezbollah if it escalated further from here.
So I'd like to maybe come back to some of the neighbors in just a minute and talk a little bit about each of them and how they perceive the crisis. But I guess, you know, before we get there, I mean, it's very interesting to hear your cautious optimism that things will not escalate in the region. But you know, I'm also detecting a fair amount of pessimism when it comes to what that major theater will be in and around Gaza. And so I guess one of the questions I have for you related to that is what do you think the consequences could be if Israel pursues it continues to pursues a very hard counteroffensive?
Well, I mean, the big question mark is what will happen afterwards, right? Like, and I do not see really a political plan so far. There is this kind of expulsion scenario that apparently was also vented in a position paper of an Israeli ministry, of which Egypt is also extremely worried about. Yeah, apparently such a plan was also brought forward by some of the very Israel-leaning European countries, I think Hungary and Austria, somewhere in Eastern Europe. And other Europeans said, no way, right? So there is not really international support for that, of course. But yes, from the Israeli side, they obviously do not want to reoccupy Gaza. They left in 2005 for a reason. At the same time, who's supposed to be administering the Gaza Strip afterwards? Israel, for good reason, is still considered the occupying power by the United Nations. So to speak of the Gaza Strip as some sort of sovereign entity, that would be not an adequate description of reality, right? Obviously, the powers that be do not control its land and sea borders or airspace. Even access to water, electricity, and so on is very much dependent on Israel. So what is coming afterwards, and these alternative plans that there could be some sort of international agency, United Nations, for example, or international troops, maybe from some Arab countries, administering the strip, is also not that likely, to be honest. To be honest, nobody wants to touch that hot potato. And the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is without legitimacy among Palestinians. So imagine if them, even if they wanted to or were ready to do so, rode into Gaza with the help of Israeli bayonets. I don't think that would be a happy end. And so it's not really clear what will happen after the military confrontation that will happen, and it's not yet clear also how successful from Israeli point of view this military confrontation will be. It might be a very protracted conflict. The ideal scenario for Israel would be to degrade Hamas military capacities and especially destroy its tunnel network, but that really requires a prolonged period of urban warfare. And yeah, does Israel have the stomach for associated losses, and will it be able to overcome the international opposition that will only start to grow from now on? With the
I mean, Eckart, I guess one of the sort of fundamental questions of what you're talking about is I wonder, what does it actually mean to eliminate Hamas, and is this even realistic? I mean, we've certainly heard Benjamin Netanyahu talking about eliminating Hamas, making it a thing of the past. How realistic is that, and what does that actually mean?
I mean, to be honest, I don't think it's that realistic, right? You cannot kill an ideology. You cannot change the immediate plight that partly feeds support for Hamas in such attacks. Let's face it, right? There is an inclination in the West, in Germany, in the US, to say, "Oh, you are not allowed to mention the Israeli occupation. We need now to criticize this terrible Hamas attack." I think you need to do both, right? It didn't come from nowhere, this attack, without justifying it. Yeah? Of course, it's a terrorist attack. But yeah, there's really a tremendous challenge whether that will really succeed in terms of military efforts. And to be honest, this rhetoric grandstanding from the Israeli side, they're all dead men and we will kill them all and so on, and they're animals and so on. That honestly sounds a bit displays rather weakness, to be honest, or a bit of not having a plan, because I don't see the ability of Israel really to even if they succeeded, let's say, in destroying a lot of the tunnels, that will buy them a couple of years, but the basic dilemma will not go away. And I also do not see Israel ready to reoccupy the Gaza Strip, and for good reasons. So I think ultimately you will need to look for a political solution. And right now, the two-state solution is dead. Yeah? Hamas and Netanyahu, they certainly hate each other, but they seem to agree on one thing. They both want to have a one-state solution with different details, of course. And I think that's not a very promising and realistic plan on both sides. And if there could be one positive thing coming out of such a war and military conflict, is that maybe finally there is some political will for a two-state solution, because otherwise I really do not see a political solution on the horizon, bearing ethnic cleansing on an epic scale, which is of course unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting that you say that, that if there's anything positive to come out of this, it could be greater political will for a two-state solution. I was recently speaking with somebody from Israel who obviously is following the situation very, very closely. And he basically said, any hope for a two-state solution has to be postponed at least by a decade because of the violence right now. And he does not think that that's something that is really feasible in the short term.
Look, I share his pessimism, but then what are the alternatives? And then the alternative is protracted civil war in the one-state reality, because this is not like a conventional war between two sovereign entities. That's much closer to some sort of civil war, and we saw it in 2021 during the last conflagration, that there was not only a conflict with Gaza, but also in the West Bank, and even among Arab Israelis, which was very shocking and frightening for many in Israel. But if you do not find some sort of two-state solution, and you live in this one-state reality, where you have very different legal status for different population groups, roughly Jewish Israelis, Arab Israelis, who are de facto second-class citizens, and then Palestinians in occupied territories, you will simply have a lot of civil war-like conflict. If that's your solution, okay, then that's what people will need to basically praise for.
Well, and I guess one other question I have for you related to this is do you think that there's anything that can be done to de-escalate the situation, and even going further, is there anything that can be done to achieve a diplomatic solution? I mean, you mentioned earlier there's obviously a struggle to find a political solution, but what can be done at least to de-escalate the situation in the short term, and then work toward a political or diplomatic solution?
Well, I think the chances are very slim right now, right? Israel would need to be offered some sort of, Hamas could lay down its arms and go into exile and release the hostages, and whatever. get some funds in return, but that's a completely unlikely scenario. And short of that, I don't think that Israel will accept the status quo before 7th of October and live with that threat. So I guess for now, there will be military confrontation. The question is, is there a window or possibility for some sort of political solution afterwards? I mean, let's face it, the Israeli side is also suffering a lot. And obviously, even the most diehard right-wing member of the current Israeli government, I think, must see that it's this one-state reality is not really a very workable solution with the current political constitution, and some sort of one-state solution where everybody would have the same rights, and all of a sudden Palestinians and Israelis decide they can live peacefully side by side in one state. I don't see happening either. Yeah? There's too much baggage, to put it mildly. So I think but at the same time, two-state solution, like, is it really possible given realities on the ground? It would require a massive resettling of Israeli settlers in occupied territories. And I do not see the political will for that within Israeli society. Yeah? You would probably have the massive conflicts within Israeli society that we have already seen with the debate around the judicial reform. Yeah.
I mean, I think that this is one of the big questions, really, of sort of whether or not all of this violence and this conflict right now will sort of spurn some thinking again about a two-state solution, because that seems like the only path forward. However, in one of the conversations I was having with somebody recently, we kind of came to the conclusion that even if there was a two-state solution, or had been a two-state solution prior to this, that would not necessarily completely rule out that a war could not have erupted and we'd be in the same situation of violence, right? I mean, I think the two-state solution might help solve some problems, but it won't help solve the underlying problem. And then the other big question, and you've talked a little bit about this, is sort of what happens next in Gaza. Israeli occupation is not likely. Egyptian rule is not likely. The Palestinian Authority doesn't have legitimacy. Is it an option to send UN troops into the region to keep the peace? I mean, that has to be a big question that people are thinking about. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Look, I haven't heard so far a workable or realistic plan, and it seems that in some of the backroom talks the Israelis had with US officials, that they didn't really have a plan. And there is one position paper essentially about ethnic cleansing, essentially deporting people from Gaza into Egypt. It was denied by the government, or kind of belittled. Well, it's just a background paper. Well, still, it's a background paper. So such discussions are obviously taking place, and Egypt is very worried about them. And the Europeans, apart from a few Eastern European countries that lean towards the Israeli side, have also announced their strong opposition to such plans.
We recently had a conversation with Stephen Erlanger, who's the chief diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times and had served as bureau chief in Jerusalem, also in Berlin. And he recently had a piece in the Times that basically said that this sudden attack has really crushed a number of assumptions that have defined the relationship or the conflict between Israel and Palestine for years. And some of those assumptions were that Hamas could be contained and the conflict could be managed, that Israel is invincible and has military superiority, that the Arab world is moving on despite the Palestine question. And from a U.S. standpoint, basically that the United States can ignore what's going on in the Middle East. I think the events of the last 3 weeks have really shown that these assumptions don't hold. I'd love to sort of hear your response to the premise of these assumptions, but also basically how you think things have changed with the events of the last 3 weeks.
Well, I mean, this premise of the Abraham Accords that you can have your cake and eat it too, I never believed it, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
So that you kind of can have a normalization with the whole Arab world without tackling the Palestinian problem in any way. On the contrary, expanding settlements, right? And settlement or violence by settlers have increased quite considerably. The conflict on the West Bank over the past year or so. So this kind of premise I never believed, and maybe actually one motivation or calculation on the Hamas side for that attack was probably to bring that Palestinian question back into the equation and possibly to get a seat at any table that might emerge in the future. So at the same time, I don't expect now the Emirates or Morocco or so to kind of cancel the steps that have been taken, but expanding from here, no. And the whole Saudi-Israeli normalization that was debated before, I think that's on the back burner for now. Also, you have to see the Arab rulers, they are very sensitive towards kind of domestic unrest, the voices of the street, and there is a very considerable degree of solidarity in Arab countries. So they cannot be seen with Israel in public right now, especially countries like Jordan, where you have a very large population of Palestinian origin.
So one of our viewers just submitted a question that ties in right there, and the question is, do you think that there's any realistic scenario where neighbors like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Qatar, Dubai, and the like would be willing to take a proactive role in providing direct governance and oversight of Gaza?
I mean, there's the Arab Peace Initiative. It's out there for 2 decades already. Basically, we accept Israel within the borders of 1967, and they accept the Palestinian state in the occupied territories. And if that initiative was taken or developed further, it's conceivable, but without that, I don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think
that leads back to this whole thing that you could solve the problem without touching the Palestinian issue. I can have normalization without touching the Palestinian issue. You can have all sorts of cooperation below the radar screen that already existed before normalization, especially in the security realm, where there's considerable similarity of interests, especially regarding Iran, which both sides, the Gulf countries and Israel, consider a threat. But like to be seen in public and have an embassy with a flag around it at the moment, oops, no. At least for those who haven't opened embassies yet.
But I guess, as you think about these relationships in the region, and you also just brought up the Abraham Accords, which are bilateral agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and an agreement with Saudi Arabia was expected to follow. These were really an attempt at normalization of relations between Israel and its neighbors. But even in these negotiations, the Palestine question was not adequately addressed, and it doesn't seem to have been addressed by anybody in the region. Why do you think that is? Is it because it's just such a contentious issue that nobody has wanted to take it on, or nobody sees an easy fix? I mean, what are some of the reasons why that's been so impossible to take on? Are the sides too hardened?
You mean the Palestinian issue, or why?
Yeah. The,
Well, it's like depending which side you ask. I think there was a window of opportunity for a two-state solution in the 90s. Yeah, the assassination of Rabin in 95 was a major blow to that. And that also leads back to my remark before, right? That he was assassinated by a radical right-wing extremist, Israeli right-wing extremist,
yeah.
and settler activist, essentially. So the kind of political capital to sell a two-state solution within Israeli society, especially after this Hamas attack now, is very difficult to achieve or to have or to spend. On the other hand, the Camp David Accords were also initiated by a very right-wing figure on the Israeli side, Menachem Begin. So maybe such solutions might come from unexpected corners, right? So we would need to see.
So one viewer just wrote that they've read that Arab rulers secretly want Hamas to be eliminated so that they can continue to reap the benefits of cooperation with Israel. Do you think that there's any validity to that?
Well, I mean, look, Hamas is certainly not popular. Okay, there are close relations with Qatar, but otherwise, look, they are an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is considered a terrorist organization in Egypt or Saudi Arabia. So there's no love lost between those countries and Hamas. At the same time, they see the humanitarian plight, and there is massive support for the Palestinian cause in those countries. Before, like 2 months or so ago, I was in Saudi Arabia for talks, and it was really interesting. The Palestinian issue came up all the time, yeah, and that was before the 7th of October, of course. So yeah, so there is no love lost, mind you. The Palestinians sided with Iraq, yeah, during the Kuwaiti occupation. Yeah? So there, and afterwards, Kuwait expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Yeah, basically almost as much as the Nakba in 1948. Yeah, but it's so there is, but at the same time, it's a double-edged sword, right? So there is not too much sympathy with especially more radical Palestinian groups, and they have threatened, especially the Gulf monarchies in the past, in the 70s, for example, and now more recently the kind of Muslim Brotherhood groups are not not popular at all among Gulf rulers, to put it mildly. But yeah, at the same time, they wouldn't be able to support any massive military escalation. And they see, of course, look, if there was a refugee problem, it would possibly destabilize a neighboring country. It might destabilize the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, if Egypt wasn't able to rein in Hamas groups then operating on Sinai. Sinai itself is not exactly a stable part of Egypt. So if Israel was really serious about just getting people out of the north of the Gaza Strip and then relocating them after cleaning up there and ridding the northern part of Hamas, they could, and that's what Egypt said, they could basically open the border to the Negev, which is their territory, and house refugees there, and then let them back in. But so there's a lot of mistrust and a lot of fear that basically there might be a massive new refugee problem that then, with a time lag, will also reach Europe, no doubt about it.
Yeah. I mean, I did have in mind to come back to the refugee problem and the whole migration issue toward the end of our conversation. So we might come back to that. But several of our viewers have anticipated that I also wanted to ask you about the international response more broadly, and specifically some questions about Germany. How would you describe the international response, and can you compare and contrast countries like Germany and the US? And I'd like to add a question to that, which is, what influence do you think Biden or Scholz can actually have?
Well, I mean, we saw it already with the Ukraine crisis, right? The West is not the center of the world anymore. There are other powers in the global South that have to be reckoned with. They have their own interests and own sensitivities. So has been very difficult for the West to gather support, if at all, in the global South and sell its narrative of the Ukraine crisis. And often there was a thinly hidden Schadenfreude that finally the West gets treated with its own medicine, yeah, essentially invading other countries at will. And people always, I heard that always with the Ukraine crisis. Well, you know, Russia is now doing to Ukraine what you do to the occupied, or Israel does to the occupied territories, or what America did in 2003 with Iraq. So what's the big deal, or why all of a sudden you want us to support that? It's your war, it's not our war. And finally, we are doing what you typically do, sitting on the sidelines, you know, trying to stay out of it. And a similar development is at play right now with that crisis. So this narrative, this is a terrorist attack, Israel has the right to self-defense, and that's it, is not accepted in that way by most countries in the global South. Yeah. So even though they see that this was a terrorist attack, you know, they also see, well, it hasn't come out of nowhere, and they see now this massive humanitarian plight. So going ahead, it will be increasingly difficult to sell that point of view. I think America and Europe need to be look out, not to kind of give Israel completely free rein or underwrite any military escalation that might take place. Also, maybe to protect Israel a bit from itself. And President Biden said already that Israel should avoid some of the mistakes that the US has committed after 9/11, that basically a lot of emotions were at play, understandably, of course, and the US waded into military escalation that it might have better avoided or have engineered in a different way. So that's a major issue, and it affects also our ability to gather support for Ukraine, as I've said. Yeah. So because basically from an Arab point of view, but also of many countries in the global South, it's okay. If you're against occupation in Ukraine, you also need to be against occupation in Palestine. And if you are not, well, then you are basically speaking with two tongues and are not credible.
You know, we recently had a discussion also with Anna Sauerbrei of Die Zeit, and obviously she's a foreign policy expert, and she said that she actually hopes that Germany will sort of step up and take on a leading role in trying to address the current challenge. And I guess I'm just wondering what even a country like Germany could possibly do to try to facilitate the process. And I'm curious whether you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I'm not sure, to be honest, right? Like Germany is not a very proactive player, rather very cautious, and in general, yeah, to wade into any foreign policy initiatives that would or might entail some sort of military component. So, and with Israel in particular, it's a very special relationship for historic reasons. Obviously, our Chancellor Angela Merkel a decade ago or so said the security of Israel is a Staatsräson, a matter of reason of state, right? Although it's never really clear what is meant by that. But for example, now there were German military supplies, no questions asked. I mean, very quick for German for Germans, yeah, or for the German situation. But to be honest, I'm not sure about that. Yeah. So, and I'm not sure whether Germany would be considered an honest broker because it's too vetted with the Israeli side. Maybe not as much as America, but pretty close. Probably other countries would be in a more credible position to bring forward diplomatic initiatives, maybe France or the European Union as a whole, if it was united, which it isn't. So I take that back. Yeah.
So
I have already that Germany tries to pedal back a bit, right? In the beginning, it was kind of ready to write a blank check for Israel. But now they, for example, have said with this bombardment of the refugee camp yesterday, Israel should basically have a more proportional approach to military retaliation.
So I have a few more questions from viewers that relate to Germany. One of our viewers asks what Germany's position is on the two-state solution and whether this would mean that East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank should stay under the rule of the Palestinian authorities. Is there an official position on the two-state solution and what that could look like?
Well, regarding maps or so, I wouldn't know, but generally, yes, the German position of the European Union is very much still in favor of the two-state solution because it's convenient, right? Like it's a rhetorical. At this stage, the two-state solution is a rhetorical device. You can remain on the sidelines and can pretend that your values are being respected and you are pursuing them. And at the same time, you do not need to enter the conflict in any way. So they're still very much in favor of it. The exact maps, it's not Germany's role to decide, right? Or that's the conflict parties basically would negotiate them. So, but that's the only way, and then maybe there could be some land swap, so that we wouldn't need to evacuate all settlements. Most of them are pretty close to the Green Line, but that the Palestinians wouldn't get anything of East Jerusalem, at least the kind of a token symbolic part of it, and that you could have the new frontier along the border fence that has been erected. I don't think that would be a realistic proposition. On the other hand, the Palestinians would need to take that bitter pill of this right of return, obviously, apart maybe from a few token elderly people that you can grant it, that is not something that Israel could accept, I think. And wouldn't make sense because the whole thing of the two-state solution is to have the two camps apart as far as possible.
Eckart, one of our viewers is curious whether there are any differences within the coalition partners in the German government regarding how Germany should react or respond to the conflict, or does there tend to be unity within the governing coalition?
I think there is a relative unity, so not just the governing coalition, this kind of pro-Israeli consensus that is all across the board, not the far left, but I mean, even the right-wing extremists of the AfD are in favor, although a lot of anti-Semites among them, of course, are pro-Israel because they are against migration, against Muslims. So among the kind of centrist parties, there is pretty much a consensus regarding Israel, and there was also this anti-BDS resolution of the German parliament, which was essentially supported by all major parties.
But we are seeing, some,
which is a problem, by the way, right? Like, which is a problem, by the way.
I mean, but the thing I think though that's interesting for those of us who are far away is, we're seeing the government position on the one side, but then we're also seeing large protests and demonstrations on the other. And so some of our viewers are curious whether the German government position is shared by that of the German public. And from what you just said, it largely is. But another viewer is curious what the government in Berlin is going to do to deal with the division that exists in Germany between those who are largely supportive of Palestinians and where there's been a sort of increasing number of anti-Semitic incidents and those who are more pro-Israeli. So is this something that can be managed?
First of all, being against Israeli occupation policies is not anti-Semitic. Yeah, there is a certain penchant to kind of trying to silence any legitimate criticism of occupation policies. Yeah, that are being criticized by the United Nations as well, and equating them with anti-Semitism. Having said that, there is of course a massive problem with anti-Semitism. It's mostly on the right. But also you have this kind of anti-imperialist anti-Semitism on the left, and really anti-Semitism in the sense this is not a criticism of Israeli occupation policies, but that you kind of have this kind of secondary anti-Semitism that basically ascribes classical anti-Semitic stereotypes to the state of Israel and singles out the state of Israel as a kind of singularly culprit on the world stage, and also attributes a kind of or dedicates an attention to it that is outsized in comparison to other states. Yeah? So that is existing, and then you have this. Of course, this new phenomenon of Islamist anti-Semitism, and you have a very considerable demography of people with a Muslim background or migratory background from the MENA region, not just since 2015, where sympathies are clearly with the Palestinian side. And of course, if the threshold to anti-Semitic protests, symbols, and so on is crossed, there needs to be a massive reaction from the security forces. But on the other hand, I mean, you cannot outlaw, I mean, for Pete's sake, they outlawed protestations against the intervention in Gaza. I mean, we're living in a democracy. This is part of freedom of speech. Yeah? So that's clear. And you need to give that room and that stage to grieve and protest as well to many people in Germany, and I think it's now given, hopefully. But I honestly was a bit shocked how they simply outlaw many demonstrations, which also shows you that there is a considerable there are considerable grievances and among the broader population, not just among Muslims or migrant communities. And that will only grow with increasingly disturbing pictures coming out of Gaza going ahead. Yeah. And the pictures of 7th of October will be increasingly forgotten, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, you know, this is something that I think is going to stay in people's minds for a very long time. And there's just a tremendous amount of concern that things can escalate. But what I think you're talking about is balancing, you know, the freedom of speech on the one hand with hate speech on the other, and how one navigates the two. I would like to come back to the migration issue, because I think that's, you know, incredibly important and certainly an issue of concern for countries like Egypt in the region and on the periphery of this crisis. But maybe one way to back into the issue of migration, one of our viewers asks if people were to be deported from Gaza, how many would Germany take in as refugees with the expectation that they would remain permanently in Germany? Is that at all realistic?
Well, to be honest, my guess is Germany would try to avoid it. The whole debate right now is that there should be a more selective approach to migration, attracting certain qualified migration, but having less the kind of illegal migration or migration without proper, let's say, preparation. So the Germany would be very disinclined to take any of those refugees in, and Egypt, of course, would like to just pass them on. Yeah, so and they will. Yeah, so I don't think that Europe could count on a lot of cooperation from the Egyptian side, for example, to prevent boats leaving Egypt towards European shores if something like that happened.
We met quite a few years ago, and your main subject of research at the time was energy, and I'm curious, as a Kenna of the region, what impact you think this conflict will have or is having on energy markets, but also on food security.
Well, I mean, on energy markets, yes, of course, there's generally those political markets. They tend to be short-lived. I mean, even the Kuwait invasion in 1990 led to a spike in oil prices, of course, but they also came back afterwards. So at the end of the day, it's more like long-term supply and demand. So neither Gaza nor Israel are producers of oil. Okay, Israel has now a bit of natural gas. Actually, natural gas prices have been most affected. Yeah. Oil prices, yes, quite a bit, but not dramatically. Yeah. And the whole transportation routes are far away from that conflict theater. Yeah. So only in this kind of massive regional escalation scenario, it is conceivable that the impact would be more substantial. But as I've in the beginning said, well, I'm cautiously optimistic that we will not see the kind of massive regional escalation scenario. I think the energy markets the impact will be not that dramatic. And for food security, well, it's again the same, right? The Middle East is not only the largest oil exporter of the world, but also the largest grain importer. But those grain trading routes, they are not now immediately affected by that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that the Suez Canal would shut down because of that conflict or so. Yeah? So the Strait of Hormuz or whatever. So in that sense, yeah, I would see the challenge even less so.
Yeah. So one of our viewers is picking up on that theme a little bit and asks whether to know more about how the current situation affects Europe in terms of concerns over domestic terrorism, energy pricing, national security writ large. I guess I would frame the question a little bit more broadly and be curious to know from you whether you think that this conflict or how does this conflict make Europe more vulnerable? Because certainly it has to make Europe vulnerable, but can you talk a little bit about how you see that vulnerability?
I mean, this whole Israel-Palestinian conflict, right, has an extreme potential for emotional and political mobilization that is kind of extremely pronounced compared to the humanitarian plight in terms of quantity or quality. Yeah? And imagine the whole Arab-Israeli conflict over the last 100 years has caused 110,000 deaths, and most of them in the conventional wars, 73 and so on, yeah, like 70 or 80,000 of them. Well, 100,000 people die like that in a season in Darfur or Tigray, 600,000 over the last few years. Yeah, nobody even knows where Tigray is. Yeah, which is also kind of unjust, right? Like that, all those that victims kind of count differently. So it has really this extreme mobilization potential, not only within the Arab world, but also in other parts of the world. Yeah, what can I say? As a result, it can also affect Europe much more in terms of debates in schools, in society. protests, and there is a considerable concern with some of the pictures, like demonstrations with anti-Semitic slogans and so on, that kind of Near Eastern conflicts are basically happening in Europe as well. It's the same with, for example, the Turkish-Kurdish conflict. There is a considerable concern that such conflicts increasingly spill over into some demographics in Europe itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, you've talked a little bit about how polarizing this conflict is altogether, right? The Arab-Israeli conflict altogether. Obviously, we're seeing that play out in this specific conflict right now. But we're also, seeing and hearing competing narratives on multiple levels, right? It's happening both in the region itself, but then we're also seeing that play out in places like Germany, where there are different groups. Can you maybe talk a little bit about these competing narratives and sort of the impact that they're having? I mean, one of the running themes that comes up in many of our discussions is concern about information that's been manipulated or is incomplete, right? I mean, the whole disinformation campaigns that one's seen in other areas. And obviously in this conflict, we're seeing some competing narratives that are, appealing to some groups, but then turning some groups off. Can you talk about how you've observed that from the different sources that you've been following in the last couple of weeks?
Well, one side is screaming apartheid and the other side is screaming anti-Semitism. And both sides scream as loud as they can, and then they go home. And in between, there's hardly any possibility for shades of gray. And when you try, you kind of are in danger of facing massive criticism, possibly professional retaliation from either side. Of course, the official narrative in the West is rather pro-Israeli, especially in Germany and the US. But in terms of kind of wider support, I think if Israel doesn't manage to find a political, or both camps find a political solution to that, Israel, I think, is losing that information war on campuses, for example, also in considerable parts of the wider public. So, but the possibility for kind of shades of gray is really limited. And as you've said, the kind of official narratives and their traction within the respective society is rather diminishing in the West, I would say. So that the kind of Palestinian cause enjoys more sympathies than it has in the past. But that's roughly it, right? One side is screaming apartheid, the other side is screaming anti-Semitism.
Well, Eckart, I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk with us today. I've certainly learned a lot and benefited from your insights. I think that this is an extremely difficult, situation for so many of us to parse and to understand, but of course also to watch. The violence is just astounding that we're seeing, and that is hard to watch, but it is a topic that we obviously need to keep looking at and studying and trying to understand. So I appreciate your sharing your insights with us today, and of course I also appreciate many great questions from our viewers. But with that, let me just say herzlichen Dank, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to talk again.
Thanks a lot, and all the best to the US.